okay. It is solid. It is a solid show. There are some good moments of animation, but nothing that completely just wowed me. You know, it was missing that wow factor.
Some would call it a sorry selection of still frames. First time? I thought to myself, how can someone look at this and say that the animation is any of these three words? Spoiled is the word I came up with to describe these manga readers. But after watching the semi-dumpster fire that was Blue Lock and thinking about it a bit more, I kind of understand where they're coming from.
So I was scrolling through Twitter like the lunatic I am, and then I caught a little bit of discourse. It was about the first fight from Sakamoto Days, which should tell you just how late I am to this conversation. Jesus fuck. Not everyone was happy with the look or animation of the show. This basically led to people saying shit like, shoulda looked like JJK, shoulda looked like Ufotable. And, yeah, no, people jumped them in the QRTs. That being said, it usually just amounted to stuff like, be grateful it doesn't look like ass, or, bro, this shit looks good! Which are surface level responses to what are probably surface level takes. Now first off, I'm not the only AniTuber who's made a video criticizing online animation discourse. The Cynic Clinic has a spectacular video doing just that from a few years back, and he's actually read books on the properties of animation. Secondly, while I'd certainly say I know a bit more about animation and film techniques than the average Twitter user and YouTube commenter, I'm by no means a professional. I may have roughly a decade of serious anime watching under my belt, and I've learned from the videos and people around me, but I'm still an amateur pseudo-critic with a writing degree and a minor in film. I never went to school for animation, nor did I do anything that would conceivably make me an animator. Challenge me to make a 5-second cut of characters doing anything in a week, and I'll spontaneously combust on drawing number 3. I haven't even studied this shit. There's a reason I pass this script around friends and people who actually have a background in the field. Thirdly, now that we've gotten some disclaimers out of the way, we need to remember that when it comes to the quality of an animated work's visuals, animation isn't everything. There's so much else to consider regarding a show's visual quality and identity. We have shows that look great despite their limited animation like Berserk 1997, and shows that look dodgy despite their fluid action animation like Fate Grand Order Babylonia. I could bring up stuff like storyboarding, which informs shot composition in both animation and live action, but I think we'll start with the concept of art direction and work our way from there. The art director is the person in charge of a show's general look, making sure everything lines up with what the director is aiming for in terms of overall aesthetic. Think of it like mise-en-scène in plays or live-action film and television. Sakamoto Days, Fate Stay Night Heaven's Feel, and Jujutsu Kaisen all look dramatically different from one another, and you can immediately see it based on their art direction, mainly regarding the backgrounds and colors. Let's look at a different modern show to give you an idea.
Hey yo, this bitch is praising Franks!
What?
Hey everyone! Boo this man!
Boo!
Fuck you, you Fate hater! Hey yo, what the fuck?
I am by no means a fan of Darling in the Franxx, but I gotta admit, it's got some pretty colors. They may not save the character designs or the script, but when you see the cities the characters live outside of, you can just feel it. Various orange lights beaming from the otherwise pitch black skyscrapers in a dome filled with black triangles. The orange lights themselves are surrounded by yellow and red. Even the technological interfaces are filled with these colors. These warm colors feel stark and oppressive, yet even more sterile than the muted pastels of the outside world. The cities are vivid yet empty, warm yet cold, inviting intrigue to an uncaring society the characters work for, yet are outside of. The striking oranges of inner-city human life are juxtaposed not by the colors and designs of the pilots, but by the blues of the enemy, the Klaxosaurs. Creatures clad in black and blue, spewing out blue blood, the shades as bold and cold as humanity's orange. The black and blue creatures spill all over the white and orange technology. Despite blue being a much colder color than orange, red, or yellow, it's reserved for these rampaging creatures, behemoths infinitely more alive than the sterile societies of the human world. It all adds to the show's desolate and sometimes mildly oppressive atmosphere in ways that are all vibrant and pleasing to the eyes. Even for dystopia standards, this setting feels grotesque at times, thanks to how the art direction brings it to life. I can almost envision an Imperial Triumphant song describing this setting. I think the colors in this show do a lot of heavy lifting in terms of the show's visuals, as its gaudy pilot uniforms with their tacky chromosome ties, the often light and unimpactful attack animations, and often pointless changes in aspect ratio represent a production that isn't nearly as intentional or skilled as its colors suggest. A common criticism of the show is that it borrows aspects from its Gainax forefathers with little understanding of what made them work. That may apply to the writing, but certainly not to the visuals. Vibrant, eye-catching colors for the tech and creatures, as well as oppressive, searing colors for certain scenes or environments that call for them, are as well understood here as they were in, say, Evangelion and Gurren Lagann. By no means do these shows look the same. They all apply these ideas successfully in their own ways. They fit the vibes and atmosphere of these shows, they enforce their visual identities, and they can tell you something about their worlds while being pleasing to the eyes. Why do you think so much fan art of Frank's focuses on the reds, blues, and oranges? Compare that to, say, Arifureta's colors, and you can immediately see which one I find more appealing. Arifureta looks eye-searing in the day and borderline invisible at night. Conversely, the colors and backgrounds in Frank's can be seen at all times and never hurt to look at. And in terms of backgrounds, it's also so much better than, say, Fate Grand Order Babylonia, where aspects of the foreground and background often blend together into this hideous mush, where it's hard to really tell where one ends and the other begins. You can also feel the drawings being plopped onto photorealistic backgrounds in some of these shots too. Now this is one of the many reasons I refuse to watch Babylonia beyond clips and shit. I'm aware that things get better later on, once the characters wind up in a different location, but still. Anyways, let's put it to you like this. One Punch Man Season 2 doesn't look as bad as it does relative to Season 1, just because the animation isn't on par. Fixing some of the abysmal animation for the Blu-ray release isn't gonna change the overall look of the show, like with the ugly, muted color palette and shading, especially in the charcoal-ass metal. It still loses all of the vibrance of Season 1, changing the aesthetic and atmosphere in a way that feels off-kilter and nowhere near as pleasing to the eyes. It looks muddy and gross. Oh, how about The Simpsons? HD Simpsons, especially pre-Season 32, had unfavorable animation comparisons to older seasons, but there's also the colors and backgrounds, which don't have the vividness of the cel-painted older seasons. How about Psycho versus its 90s remake? Colors are their own visual language, which can inform a work's visual identity, and they can fit or detract from a work's intentions. Now, look at Sakamoto Days, with its earthy, muted color tones and backgrounds, or Heaven's Feel with its vibrant yet somewhat muted colored characters and realistic looking backgrounds. Look at Jujutsu Kaisen's colors and backgrounds, which are simultaneously vivid yet subdued. You can immediately feel that these shows look different from each other, while also being worlds apart from Frank's or Gurren Lagann. Heaven's Feel and Jujutsu Kaisen are set in urban fantasy settings rather than dystopias after all. Yet there's something about Sakamoto Days which immediately has a different vibe from those other two shows with how it looks, and that informs the atmosphere and general nature of the show. Now I vastly prefer the look of Heaven's Feel to the muddy visuals of Sakamoto Days, which looks more akin to, say, Eden Zero, but I don't think making Sakamoto Days look like HF would be right. And this leads us to the atmosphere. Heaven's Feel is a nocturnal trilogy, as is standard for Type Moon. There's plenty of fun to be had in the daylight, but when dusk and darkness arrive, so do the sinister elements. This applies to Zero and UBW as well. Most of the slice of life and general positive elements, the times where people get to live their daily lives, take place during the day, and all of the bloodshed, destruction, and bombast occurs when the sun goes down. However, HF in particular feels wrong. With the haunting chimes of Yuki Kajira's score, and the often rainy, photorealistic backgrounds of the first two films in the dark, all creating a tense atmosphere. Everything has this uncomfortable, almost Wes Craven-esque shine and pristineness at night, from the rain-soaked roads to the dingy, grimy back alleys. the night is never safe, always dangerous, as the Holy Grail War primarily occurs in darkness, where citizens are often out of sight, and mythical beings slaughter each other and their masters. The first film is especially misty at night, emphasizing how unnerving the setting can be. Hell, most of the time, we're either in the sunset or at night, with few moments of complete daylight. Even moments in protagonist Shiro Emiya's house have somewhat dim lights or take place in darkness, as often or more so than during the day. Often, the saturated lights are stark and oppressive, matching the drama and longing that unfold. HF in particular feels the way it does to suit the tone and plot, where everything goes unimaginably haywire, even by the standards of the Holy Grail War. It's grim, with horrifying, hitherto unforeseen essences taking shape, corrupting the war, slaughtering combatants and civilians alike in its wanton gorging. The films also contain depictions of sexual assault and all sorts of other bleak circumstances. HF is capable of lightheartedness and solace on occasion, and its color palette does still support that here like in UBW. However, HF is ultimately a tonally dour, nocturnal urban fantasy, where its characters are generally uncomfortable, if not miserable. The atmosphere, the mood, all suit the setting and narrative as required. Sakamoto Days is a completely different beast in its visual identity. It's an action comedy battle shonen about a former assassin settling down with his wife as they work in a konbini with a failed assailant while being hunted by Sakamoto's former colleagues. Sakamoto doesn't fight his opponents to the death, his wife won't allow it. He finds non-lethal ways to take them down, sometimes creatively, to maintain a happily married and employed life in this average, everyday setting. Any gruesome bloodshed is an echo of the past, and it's not like his human opponents have any crazy superpowers unlike in HF. They're just assassins trying to take down a guy ordered by his wife to not break their no-killing rule, at least for a few episodes. It's only in episodes 5, 8, and 9 where things start to get bloodier and more serious. And even then, no more so than the average battle shonen. Think of it like comparing the tokusatsu Kamen Rider Double to its sequel manga and anime, Futo Pi. Kamen Rider Double is a kids' toku primarily taking place during the day. Its antagonists transform into monsters who rarely kill, often instead torturing people emotionally or turning them into objects. It's a generally light-hearted and optimistic show with a low body count, even in its occasionally more somber storylines. Its setting, the windy city of Futo, comes alive in the everyday interactions its protagonists have with the regular city dwellers they're friends with, as they investigate dangerous yet rarely lethal drug allegory cases. Its atmosphere is an inviting one more often than not. It's not extremely vibrant, but it's colorful and pleasant, teeming with life and charm. It's little wonder that one of its main leads, Shotaro Hidari, holds the city's heart so sacred. By contrast, Futo Pi is a night broadcast show not meant for those same kids, and its murder mysteries regularly leave substantial body counts. The city gains an even seedier underbelly to tap into, usually at night. The atmosphere is much less inviting, especially when the characters learn what's on the other side. The series maintains some of its optimism and humor, but its designs and tone are markedly changed, along with the kinds of stories that can be told. And it doesn't have the same kind of slapstick the Toku had. You could make it more like the original. Hell, I'd probably appreciate less altered returning designs. But you'd lose out on the contrast and some of the opportunities the nocturnal variation of the setting provides. It would also risk losing out on the somewhat darker tone. It wouldn't feel right, just like how Sakamoto Days wouldn't feel right looking like Heaven's Feel. Another underdiscussed aspect of a show's visual identity is the editing. Part of that is because in professional film and television, edits are meant to go unnoticed more often than not. Outside of scene transitions, you're not meant to notice something being edited. You're meant to notice the scene as it is, without anything breaking the immersion, like a character cut out of a scene a few frames too soon, or a character's mustache being edited out in ways that feel uncanny. Live action, especially tokusatsu and cape shit, operate under heightened reality. However, outside of CGI and practical effects to an extent, edits are meant to be sleight of hand, baked into the images on screen for an artistic purpose, regardless of any conformity to reality. Even slow motion falls under this, and it itself is multi-purpose, as is how you cut between scenes or shots of characters talking in the same scene. In anime, there's a bit more room for obvious edits to punctuate something, either for kitschy comedic effect or for heightening the intensity of a situation. Think of the speed lines used whenever a character is freaking out in Kaguya-sama or Kimetsu no Yaiba. Think of obviously non-diegetic sound effects to use whenever a character is ranting and raving or getting into some kind of accident. Sometimes it's quick, rhythmic cuts to sell a frantic pace or multiple characters talking at once without just shoving them all into frame like in Code Geass. Sometimes it's inverting or distorting the colors during a particularly dicey sequence to further sell the dread and horror a character feels, like in Code Geass. Yeah, Code Geass is actually a great example of how good editing can enhance a show's over-the-top dramatic nature. Compare this to, say, Kimetsu no Yaiba, and it becomes clear why Geass works and Kimetsu no Yaiba doesn't. The latter already struggled with the integration of CGI in places, and that remains a constant as far in as the Swordsmith Village arc, though that's more of an issue with compositing. However, that's not the most ridiculed aspect of the series' visuals anymore. Nowadays, you get stuff like the Congregation of Upper Moons in that arc, or Muzan's long-ass walk in the latest season. You know that one Indian soap opera people memed on for its absurdly overindulgent editing? There's a reason people compared the Congregation to that when Season 3 debuted. There are so many unnecessary camera movements, twitchy cuts, and overlays that it's impossible to take this scene seriously or think of it as cool or ominous. It's ridiculous! Muzan's infamous slow-mo walk during the Hashira training arc is hilarious for similar reasons. It takes you out of the experience rather than enhancing it, and it's not like this show is meant to be over the top in the same way Code Geass is. Hell, they didn't just end episode 7 of season 4 with this, they repeated part of it to open episode 8, just with the Yuki Kajiro OST instead of the Hyde and My First Story ED. And it's even funnier! They practically made this for hip-hop edits on YouTube and TikTok. Anyway, now let's look at this first fight in Sakamoto Days. Immediately the show employs slow-mo, and swivels the digital camera around to follow the cough drop Sakamoto spat out against Shin Asakura's gunshot, before cutting to a slow-mo shot of the bullet breaking his bag of chips. All of this is set to some lavish animation, and even a couple of frames of pitch darkness to highlight the sheer destructive force with which the bullet demolishes the cough drop. The grayscale in this moment guides your eyes to the colored parts of the frame and has the color correction fade as Shin regains his bearings after a bit of shock at what Sakamoto just did before reloading and narrowly avoiding a popsicle to the face. We then cut to his perspective in first person, having lost track of Sakamoto and trying to find him, before we cut to Sakamoto taking cover. These first 20 seconds are already a brilliant showcase of action animation before the rest of the scene plays out. After distracting Shin and providing some cool angles for Sakamoto's next attack, the cuts get even more frantic as Shin tries to retaliate. With the armed intruder caught and completely off guard, Sakamoto launches a roundhouse kick that Shin isn't fast enough to react to. We get some more color shifting on the paused frame after some slow-mo to really sell how fucked Shin knows he is. Then BAM! Look at the wind recoil animation. Look at the shelves moving almost like they're being contorted from Shin getting launched through them. It all slows down from here as the fight's already won. This fight is not only well animated, but edited to near perfection. It's easy to follow and satisfying with its impacts. Plus, unlike say, One Punch Man 2 or JJK 2, the TV broadcast isn't mauled to death by the network's nauseating overuse of ghosting to drown out every cut they think could possibly risk triggering epilepsy. Which is funny because the show could actually use a little bit of that sometimes. Compare this fight to, say, Salter vs. Berserker from HF Film 2, Lost Butterfly. This fight is a gorgeous, electrifying scene that excels in similar aspects. It's not as tactically driven, but it doesn't need to be, since it's about two powerhouses launching each other with brute force, trying to outpace each other and land the next blow. The particle effects and the vigorous red, purple, and black of Salter's blisteringly animated attacks are especially eye-catching, and each blow is delivered with meteoric impact. It's larger than life, whereas Sakamoto Days is suitably small scale. That being said, one issue I have with the fight that isn't present in the Sakamoto Days one is that it breaks the 180-degree rule frequently. The fighters do dart all over the place, but sometimes they're being launched left, and before they've even finished, suddenly they're flying right. This forces me to readjust constantly, taking me out of the fight, if only for a brief second every now and then. It could be a whole lot worse. It's not as hard to follow as, say, parts of the Yuji and Todo versus Hanami fight in Jujutsu Kaisen, where attempting to keep track results in a borderline disorienting experience. It's also not like the camera's making the experience dizzying or incomprehensible, like the Code Geass Akito the Exiled films or Hitler Satan. It's easy to say that the HF fight is better than Sakamoto's. It's a fist-bumping action scene for a film with absurd Sakuga cuts and an epic choir. Compared to Sakamoto Days' 1 minute of airtight combat, this fight scene is much longer while having freakishly good cuts. It's a tour de force, but it's got its issues. The Sakamoto Days fight isn't as technically proficient in terms of nut-busting animation, but it's a piece of relatively high-quality TV animation with no real issues unless you just hate the look of the show. Now imagine if you swap the look of both anime for their fights, taking everything I've said into account. It would be a horrifying mismatch. You can criticize the color choices and general aesthetic of Sakamoto Days for sure, but let's not act that it needs to look like a completely different anime with a different atmosphere and priorities and everything to work. Mob Psycho 100 doesn't need to look like Chainsaw Man or Frieren to be one of the most stunningly animated shows of the past 10 years 3 times over. And Sakamoto Days doesn't need to look like Ufotable or most MAPPA shows to succeed at what it's going for. It's all about what suits the content and intentions of a work, not about what looks the flashiest or prettiest. But hey, let's actually criticize the look of Sakamoto while we're here. The color tones are a little too earthy, and combined with the art style and muddy line work, it makes the show look kinda ugly a lot of the time. It's not quite One Punch Man too bad, as I said, and I understand that the color palette is broadly in line with the colors of the manga cover arts. However, it's not exactly easy on the eyes, and it could have been toned down just a little. The color art regarding the manga was at least a little more vivid and vibrant at times, albeit usually still relatively muted. And I guess this is where the MAPPA comparison makes sense, considering the look of Chainsaw Man Season 1 and Jujutsu Kaisen Season 1. Those shows have earthy tones for their gritty urban fantasy settings, and this show is an action comedy battle shonen in an everyday setting teeming with assassins. That being said, honestly, if I were to even choose one to work with, Chainsaw Man makes much more sense. And also, more importantly, my criticisms mainly apply to the daytime scenes. At night, the colors come alive, especially the black guns with impeccable shading and outlines on some of the characters. At least, this applies to scenes that are lit by the moon rather than yellow lights, like the amusement park at night. Plus, the choice to further saturate the colors during select moments in fight scenes is a welcome one that wields the show's unsavory color palette to its advantage. It does overuse that, but when it works, it works. The first scene of the show containing sepia tone and somewhat transparent letterboxing, the first-person perspective moment of a character aiming their gun in a later fight scene, and plenty of other moments stick out in terms of using the show's digital camera and post-production techniques to its advantage. You can tell that Masaki Watanabe and the staff primarily at TMS Entertainment wanted to sell a sense of style, an atmosphere of coolness to juxtapose the comfy vibes of Sakamoto's daily life. That juxtaposition also informs the comedy around a former assassin disabling his opponents with mainly convenience store goods and fists while having tripled his weight. It's just that, outside of those scenes, and sometimes even during them, the adaptation does look a little garish. Plus, there's also this critique Bonsai Pop made about the artwork, which, even from skimming the manga, yeah, I get it.
That said, they are missing a certain gravity the manga somehow manages to create. It's almost too goofy in the anime and doesn't really capture how deadly Sakamoto is under the chunk or how deadly the situations he ends up in are. Coloring and shading were done really well. It's got a nice pastel color palette with almost a crayon-esque fill texture to it, which you can tell was chosen to give it that cartoony feel you get during downtime in the manga. However, this doesn't change during the fight scene. scenes, which removes that necessary juxtaposition I mentioned earlier.
Granted, sometimes the anime does show some of that difference with Sakamoto, but still. Plus, while there are some excellent fight scenes, not every fight is nearly as effective, as many of them are just sorta fine, if not straight up mediocre. Plus, sometimes when a fight goes from one episode to the next, and the more impactful moment is in the back half, the animation is a lot more stilted and less fluid than what came before. The weaker fights aren't poorly animated per se, nor are they hard to follow, but they're not impressive enough to make up for the ugly aesthetic like the episode 1 fights do. As such, the end result is a bit of a mixed bag, where the fights range from mediocre to impressive, but the visual identity of the show doesn't quite hit the mark. It's kinda like Need for Speed Most Wanted. It can sell some exhilarating action set pieces, but it's got that ugly piss filter and aesthetic to it for the realistic setting, and that can be kind of off-putting. The disappointment people have with this adaptation not being on the level of, say, One Punch Man, Mob Psycho 100, or Dandadan is understandable. It's a competent adaptation whose good qualities have gotten largely overlooked, but I think it wouldn't get as much flack if it wasn't for the muddy art direction. It's a shame, because even outside of episode 1, we have stuff like the first half of Sakamoto vs. Boiled in episode 4, and Heisuke and Shin vs. Seiba in episode 9. Plus, for as much shit as I've given the colors on this show, it doesn't look that bad most of the time. At least until the final arc of part 1. The casino in the last 2 episodes put the show's worst qualities on full display. Plenty of productions would melt if they tried to have the level of Sakuga present in modern One Piece, where every fight scene seems to have been animated in ones, or 24 frames per second. Every JJK production has some of the most infamous cases of crunch in the past several years, even by anime standards. Hell, Hero Academia Season 4 onwards struggled to keep the animation quality people were used to, at least in part because plenty of Bones animators and other freelancers who might have been working on the show were pulled to work on the movies. Time and personnel are more limited than ever these days, and I imagine TMS Entertainment worked with their networks to make the 20+ episode Sakamoto Days adaptation split course and act of foresight. The results are a bit hit and miss, and I imagine part 2 won't be so different, but that also means we got and will continue to get some well-crafted fight scenes and moments. Maybe if they get a continuation after part 2, they could lighten up the colors and tweak the art style a bit, like with Chainsaw Man going to the Reize movie, I don't know. Holy shit, I let this go on for so long that we actually got a trailer for part 2, and it already looks better than part 1. People want Sakamoto Days to be as jaw-dropping as the best Jujutsu Kaisen and Heaven's Feel fights, with all the practical and digital effects in the world, and every fight to be animated on ones. But animation isn't everything. Sakamoto Days has some well-animated fight scenes, but animation isn't everything. Neither is editing, or art direction, or any one component in a work's visual identity. They're all individual parts of a larger whole, and if any of them fails to measure up, people will notice, and blame the animation anyway. Just like they'll credit the animation when one of these other pillars steals the show.